Hey guys, tonight we drift back into the powdered past where candle flames flicker against gilt-framed mirrors and the air smells like overripe fruit sweat and expensive regret. You're wandering the echoing halls of Versailles just past midnight. Velvet drapes billow as you pass, brushing your shoulders like the hem of a gossipy duchess's gown. A far-off violin plays something you don't recognize but instantly trust. And as you shuffle in your too-tight borrowed slippers, you hear whispers floating along the marble whispers, not of politics or war, but shoes. Yes, shoes. Specifically pointy, towering, absurdly fragile heels that threaten to snap under the weight of powdered wigs and pride. You blink confused. Why would anyone legislate something so silly? You probably won't survive this navigating Versailles without twisting an ankle, that is. But you're here now, and we have gossip to unravel. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I always love seeing how far and wide our sleepy little history club stretches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You glide past a golden clock, chiming softly at the top of the hour. It's 1200 a.m., just when Versailles is at its most secretive. The nobles have retired to their salons, the wine has been poured, and someone in the corner is laughing just a little too loudly. Everything here sparkles with artifice. It's not just the chandeliers, it's the people too. And tonight they're whispering about a new rumor, a law is coming. About heels. You peer down at your borrowed pair, ridiculously pointy, dangerously thin. You've already stumbled 3 times. They're less shoes and more fashionable stilts. But here in Versailles, they're a necessity. Not for walking, don't be absurd, but for being seen. For existing. For mattering. In the 18th century, shoes weren't just protection from the street, though frankly these wouldn't survive a puddle. They were status, a visual shortcut. And in the razor-sharp court of Louis XV and his successor fashion, was war fought silently, one accessory at a time. That's what brings us to this odd reality: France would eventually regulate the heel. The government, yes, actual lawmakers with powdered wigs and probably gout, sat down and debated pointy footwear. Historians still argue whether this was about control or morality, or simply an absurd symptom of courtly obsession. But the fact remains, in a time of famine and fermenting revolution, somebody's job was to write a legal opinion on how sharp a heel could be before it became a threat. Let that settle in. Outside you can hear a night owl cry, a nobleman too drunk to find his chambers. You sidestep a dog curled in the hall, its eyes following your teetering walk with silent judgment. Even pets here know better than to wear something so uncomfortable. Earlier in the evening, you pass through the Hall of Mirrors where nobles practice their court smiles while adjusting their shoe buckles. That's right, mirrors weren't just for vanity. They were a battlefield for presentation. One wrong step, one squeak, one wobbly heel, and you might lose status forever. Pointy heels with their exaggerated curves and fragile construction were both a weapon and a trap. You couldn't just wear them, you had to master them. A lady you met earlier, Madame d'Aubigny, maybe? Or was it de Montvoisin showed off her new pair imported from Italy, lacquered in deep plum and tipped in pure silver? They make me taller and my enemies smaller, she'd said with a smirk. But someone else muttered. Not for long. The fashion police were real, and in this case they worked for the king. It wasn't just about who wore the heels, it was about what they meant. Women's shoes screamed elegant submission excess. Men's shoes, power. Dominance? Heels weren't even originally for women, you'll learn that soon. Tonight though, everyone's pretending otherwise, straining their ankles for one more inch of relevance. The hallway grows quieter as you walk. Behind one door you catch a flash of red cardinal silk, maybe followed by a hissed argument about whether Madame du Barry's shoes violated the new angle code. Apparently, there was talk of assigning a specific degree of curvature for acceptable heels. Yes, someone wanted to measure decadence with a protractor. You pass a portrait. The Marquisate is glaring slightly hand-on-hip foot forward to show off a particularly aggressive heel. The artist has rendered the shoe in more detail than the face. Priorities. A mouse scurries under the tapestry. Even it knows better than to get caught in the fashion crossfire. You tiptoe past the royal apartments, careful not to disturb anyone, and more careful still not to twist your ankle. Your calves burn from compensating for the angle of your heels. You wonder, were these shoes designed as a prank? Or was pain just part of the look? Scholars still argue whether the original heel laws were intended to curb vanity, restrict women, reinforce class barriers, or all three at once. Some say it was morality masquerading as safety. Others insist it was about maintaining the hierarchy: flat shoes for workers, heeled shoes for rulers. But tonight that debate doesn't matter. What matters is that people cared enough to argue. And as you sink onto a velvet bench, feet throbbing, you realize something simple if fashion is suffering. Then 18th century France was bleeding glitter. You're still on that velvet bench toes, finally freed from their pointy prison, but your mind drifts backward farther than Versailles. Because if you're going to understand why French lawmakers ended up obsessed with the geometry of a shoe, you'll need to trace the pointy heel back to its origins. And no, it didn't start with Marie Antoinette teetering through a garden or some foppish duke tripping over himself at court. Go back farther, farther still. You're in the Middle East now, Persia to be exact, around the 10th century. A land of desert caravans, powerful horsemen, and wait for it, practical heeled footwear. Yes, heels started as functional. Try not to faint. You see, Persian cavalry wore heels to secure their feet in stirrups, while standing to shoot arrows, because nothing ruins a dramatic gallop like slipping mid-shot. The heel wasn't a style statement, it was a saddle survival tool. Strong, thick, short, and functional. And when Persian emissaries made their way to Europe centuries later, bringing gifts and culture and oddly compelling shoes, the nobles of France raised their well-plucked eyebrows and said, "Yes, but make it fabulous." Fast forward to the early 17th century, and the first French noble to really lean into this imported trend was none other than Louis XIV, also known as the Sun King. He adored heels, especially red ones, especially ones that made him taller than everyone else in the room. If Persian warriors wore heels for war, Louis wore them for dominance. He literally issued a royal decree that only nobles of high rank could wear red heels. A fashion flex with legal backup. You now stand in front of a painted court scene, watching powdered courtiers shuffle in their high-heeled shoes, careful not to scuff the red paint, lest someone question their pedigree. These shoes weren't just accessories, they were a statement, a license, a social weapon. You didn't earn your stripes here, you earned your inches. The style evolved. By the 18th century, heels were narrower, taller, and yes, pointier. Cobblers competed to create the most exaggerated shapes. You peek into one of their dim workshops. There's a fire burning scraps of satin scattered across a wooden table and a man hunched over a shoe mold like he's carving a marble statue. He's shaping the toe into something sharp enough to open a letter. The shoes are stiff, unyielding, and frankly terrifying. You pick one up and examine it. It's almost vertical, as if someone took a boot and dared it to be an art piece. The insole is so hard it could probably double as a cutting board. Fashion has officially lost the plot, and yet they sell. Because the pointier the toe, the more elite the wearer. These aren't walking shoes, these are sitting down and being admired shoes. You could balance a whole revolution on the contradiction. They represent the desire to be elevated and the pain required to stay there. Historians still argue whether the pointy heel's evolution was driven more by shoemakers' ambition or by the aristocracy's hunger for constant reinvention. Either way, by mid-century, the shoes were absurd enough to draw serious public scrutiny. And by scrutiny, we mean gossip columns, court sermons, and eventually, the law. You exit the cobbler's shop and walk past a row of mannequins in a boutique window, each frozen mid-step. Their shoes are pointed like daggers. You try to imagine walking down a cobblestone street in them. You can't. Not unless you're prepared to crawl part way. And yet these shoes were considered essential. Back in Versailles, nobles discussed shoes the way we discuss sports cars or limited edition sneakers. People commissioned poems about them. One noblewoman reportedly demanded her coffin be buried with her favorite pair, a lavender heel so aggressively curved it looked like it was wincing. But these weren't just vanity projects. Shoes made statements. If you were seen with a pair that was out of season or too worn or not quite the right arch, it was social suicide. If your heel was too short, you risked being mistaken for a servant. If it was too tall, you risked mockery for trying too hard. It was a Goldilocks nightmare. And no, there were no comfortable beds in sight. One fringe fashion historian claimed that heel height increased every year from 1730 to 1765, right up until laws tried to cap it. Others say the change was less about vertical height and more about pointiness. But everyone agrees on this. By the 1750s, something had to give, and you can feel it now. The tension, not just in your arches, but in the air. Like the shoes themselves, society is strained elegant on the surface, deeply uncomfortable underneath. You make your way down a quiet garden path behind the palace. The gravel crunches beneath your borrowed shoes. You imagine the courtiers here practicing their walk, trying to perfect a heel-to-toe glide that wouldn't make them wobble or wince. There were walking tutors. Yes, actual people whose job it was to teach the wealthy how to move in their shoes without looking like newborn deer. So of course the question had to be asked if everyone was toppling over in the name of fashion, and if heels had morphed into absurd social props rather than shoes. Should there be rules? It sounds ridiculous. You chuckle under your breath. But a world where someone could measure your morality by your footwear, that was France. 18th century France, where style wasn't optional and neither increasingly was regulation. You find yourself on a staircase now, one of those impossibly grand ones in the smaller wings of Versailles, not meant for kings but for courtiers who wanted to feel like kings. Each step is shallow but wide designed, more for floating down dramatically than for practical ascent. And here you are teetering again because your heels, your thoroughly borrowed, deeply ridiculous heels, are too narrow for balance and too tall for mercy. You pause halfway up panting like someone who's just climbed a small mountain in stilts. And honestly, you have. Because that's the thing, in 18th century France, height was everything. Not just literal height, social height, symbolic height, emotional height. The kind that puts you above your neighbor, even if just by an inch, and preferably in crimson leather with embroidered silk trim. Heels became a measurement not of size, but of class. You reach the top of the stairs and lean on the carved railing, surveying the scene below like a weary duchess. There's a gaggle of powdered nobles in the foyer, posturing with the careful art of people who know exactly what every detail of their outfit says about them. The taller the heel, the longer the stair. And this wasn't a coincidence. For the aristocracy, a pointed heel did more than lift the body. It elevated the wearer out of the realm of work and into the realm of leisure. Only those who didn't have to walk far could afford such impractical shoes. If your heel was narrow enough to snap, you clearly weren't mucking stables or hauling baskets. That was your resume right there, hanging from your ankle. Men too embraced the look, especially men. In fact, at one point, aristocratic men's heels were higher and more flamboyant than women's. That's a sentence you don't expect to hear every day. But here in Versailles, it's just Tuesday. King Louis XIV set the trend, and his successors expanded it. Men's shoes were decorated, elevated, curved, dyed, and trimmed until they looked like tiny thrones for your feet. And again, they were designed not to function, but to signify. Signify that you were above the mud, above the sweat, above the entire working class. There's a fringe theory that heel height increased in direct proportion to class anxiety. That, as the line between nobility and wealthy commoners blurred, fashion stepped in to stretch the gap, literally. If the rising bourgeoisie could buy silk and lace, at least the nobility could still buy extra inches. Historians still argue whether this escalation was conscious strategy or a natural spiral of competitive vanity. One thing's for sure, the higher the heel, the more ridiculous the risk. You now descend a servant's corridor where practicality rules. Their shoes, low, thick-soled, scuffed, are built for movement, not for statements. You feel a flicker of envy, not just for the comfort, but for the freedom. No one's measuring them. No one's watching their arches with suspicion. Back among the nobles, everything was scrutinized. There were whispered charts of acceptable heel height by age and title. A baron 2¼ inches. A duchess 3 unless she's recently widowed. A young noblewoman debuting at court taller still so long as she could make it across the dance floor without a sprained ankle or public humiliation. And let's not forget toe shape. A heel without a pointed toe was seen as provincial. Rounded toes were for children. Square toes don't even. The pointier the toe, the sharper the impression. Women were said to look cleverer with a shoe that extended past their natural foot. It literally elongated their profile and supposedly their elegance. You pass through a gallery now, a quiet room of portraits. And in almost every frame, the subject has turned their body ever so slightly to reveal their footwear. In one, a viscount's leg juts forward like he's doing ballet, red-heeled and puffed with pride. In another, a lady's gown has been lifted just enough to show off a shoe curved like a question mark. These weren't just paintings, they were advertisements, signals. You mattered because you could afford to, because your shoes told the world you were idle, pampered, and above all seen. Of course, that created a dilemma. The more extravagant the heel, the more obvious the gap between classes. And the more obvious the gap, the more frustrated the people at the bottom became. A baker's wife might manage a satin ribbon here and there, but she'd never dare sport a heel so pointy it looked like it could pierce the revolution. You find yourself by the palace gates now. Beyond them lies Paris, where the street smells like bread and coal and people's real lives. There, shoes are made for durability, for weather, for puddles that don't care about court protocol, and yet even there the fashion bleeds in. Ambitious townsfolk began copying court styles in cheaper materials. Cobbler districts sprang up that specialized in imitation heels. They weren't as elegant, they weren't as sturdy, but they were pointy. And that was enough for some. This worried the elite. Imitation might be the sincerest form of flattery, but here it felt like trespass. Suddenly, heels weren't a sign of birthright. They were a sign of ambition. And that was dangerous. So the murmurs began. Maybe there should be limits. Maybe the poor shouldn't look like the rich. Maybe a heel should signal exactly what you were allowed to be. And as you slip quietly back into the marble corridors of the palace, you can already hear the debate forming in the salons. Not about fashion, but about control. You're in a drawing room now. Not the kind open to everyone, not even most nobles. This is one of those exclusive salons tucked behind a silk-paneled wall with furniture too fragile to sit on. And tea served in cups so delicate you're afraid to breathe near them. It's the type of room where elegance doesn't just speak, it whispers, gossips, and occasionally hisses. And tonight the whispering is about shoes, again. But it's different now. There's tension in the air, a new flavor to the scandal. You settle quietly into a corner chair, careful to tuck your aching feet beneath you. Across the room, a young marquis is arguing with a duchess about heel angles. Too much curvature, he sniffs, suggests moral instability. The duchess doesn't even blink. So does an unpowdered wig, darling, and yet here you are. They're joking mostly, but only mostly. Because this isn't just fashion anymore, it's a battleground. The pointy heel has grown so exaggerated, so absurd that it's now being accused of corrupting the soul. You sip your imaginary tea. Outside the gilded windows, the world spins in real time. Harvests fail, bread prices rise, and murmurs of unrest blow in from Paris. But in here, the biggest crisis is whether or not a certain heel makes a woman's walk look too suggestive. Welcome to the heel wars. One cleric recently wrote a pamphlet declaring high heels an invitation to sin. Another claimed the shoes were Satan's stilts, elevating women into temptation itself. You imagine that phrase on a fashion label and smirk. Historians still argue whether this moral panic was genuine piety or thinly veiled sexism. Either way, the heel had become a lightning rod. The church railed against it. Conservative nobles clutched their pearls. Mothers warned their daughters about crooked steps leading to scandal. Of course, none of this stopped anyone from wearing them. In fact, it made the shoes more popular. The more forbidden they became, the more alluring, like sugar during wartime or glitter in a middle school. A pamphlet circulates through the room passed hand to hand. It's anonymous, of course, everything fun was. It depicts a heel so pointy it pierces the floor, leaving a trail of cracks behind it. The caption reads, "Where her foot treads, modesty shatters." You nearly laugh out loud. It's ridiculous. and yet you're the only one smiling. Beside you, an older countess leans in and murmurs, "It's always the things we balance on that give us away. Heels, morals, husbands." Then she downs her sherry and floats out of the room like a ghost who knows too much. The debate continues. A baron bright red with indignation insists the government must act. Regulation, he huffs, is civilization. A viscount argues back, "You cannot legislate grace," then trips over his own shoe on the way to the buffet. And yet soon enough, that's exactly what happens. A preliminary edict is drafted. You're there, sort of. Eavesdropping at a salon 2 nights later, where a young bureaucrat with nervous hands and a voice like a breaking wine glass reads aloud from the proposed text. Heels, he declares, must be no taller than 2 pouces, and 4 leans roughly 2.5 inches by modern reckoning. The toe, he continues, must not extend more than 3 doits from the natural foot. He clears his throat like someone about to faint into a lace curtain. There's stunned silence. Then, uproar. Arguments break out in pairs and trios. Someone throws a spoon. The Duchess from earlier dramatically faints onto a chaise longue, though it's unclear whether from outrage or exhaustion. You slip outside for air. The palace garden is cooler, calmer. You sit on a stone bench and kick off your shoes with a sigh of relief. A moonbeam catches on the heel's curved edge, casting a long, ridiculous shadow. And you can't help but think, is this where the world starts to crack? Not with war or famine, but with footwear. Some fringe historians actually suggest as much. That the obsession with superficial rules shoes, dress codes, powdered wigs wasn't just silly, but symptomatic. A society so busy regulating its own wardrobe was too distracted to notice its foundation buckling beneath it. Inside, the music swells again. A minuet begins. Courtiers adjust their shoes and glide onto the dance floor heels, tapping in soft, orchestrated chaos. You know what they say, the higher the heel, the closer to disaster. Still, you admire the confidence. Even if it's all performative. Even if the toes are bleeding. Because hairstyle is substance. And the laws they're drafting, they're less about stability and more about signaling. Who belongs? Who dares? Who rises and who falls flat face first into parquet. You head back in just in time to hear the final draft of the proposed legislation. There's a clause about slipper inspections at court entrances. Another about heel permits for state events. Everyone's pretending to take it seriously. No one really believes it'll pass. But that's the thing about fashion laws, they never feel real until you're fined for fabulousness. You're waking up figuratively, of course, in a court office now. Not the glamorous kind with chandeliers and champagne. No, this one smells like old ink and anxious parchment. You're seated at the edge of a long wooden table while a clerk with truly unfortunate sideburns mutters to himself, rereading the law draft for what must be the 100th time. Yes, it's really happening. The Kingdom of France is about to pass an actual law about shoes. Specifically a law about the pointiness and height of heels. The year is somewhere in the early 1770s. The Enlightenment is in full swing. People are reading Rousseau and Voltaire, debating liberty, reason, and natural rights. And yet at the same time, somewhere between philosophical treatises and political unrest, a group of powdered officials are laser focused on regulating how high your shoe can lift your foot off the floor. You stare at the paper in front of you. It's very official looking. The header bears the royal seal, flanked by 2 stern-looking lions who clearly disapprove of flamboyant footwear. The language is elaborate. This is France after all, and peppered with legalese so dense you could use it to stuff a sofa. But if you squint past the lace trim and wax seals the meaning as clear heels above a certain height are now forbidden at court. So are excessively narrow points. Toe exaggeration is officially out. Curvature limits are defined in pouces, leans, and measurements, so antique they might as well be alchemy. Why? That's the part no one can quite agree on. Historians still argue whether the law was genuinely about safety so no one tripped into the soup, or whether it was about morality or even a sneaky way to reinforce social hierarchy. One school of thought suggests the heel law was aimed at social climbers' bourgeoisie, mimicking the nobility too convincingly. Another theory insists it was an effort to shame women who looked too fashion-forward, too powerful, too visibly confident. But whatever the motive, the law passes. Not overnight, not cleanly. But with enough murmured support and enough scandalous anecdotes, did you hear the Duchess who sprained her ankle mid-curtsy? The regulation becomes real. You watch the clerk blot his final copy. He folds it with trembling hands, then seals it with a practiced snap. Somewhere, a messenger will carry it to a posting wall in Paris. Somewhere else, a cobbler will sigh and quietly measure his latest creation 1 inch shorter than planned. You leave the office and find yourself in the court's outer hallway. Already whispers have started. A maid is crying her mistress just canceled a custom shoe order. A minor nobleman fumes, clutching his boots like wounded pets. But these were commissioned from Florence, he wails. And just down the hall, someone's laughing. You follow the sound and find a seamstress you think her name is Renee, reclining against a tapestry, sipping cheap wine from an expensive cup. They think the law will change anything, she scoffs. Honey, we make fashion, not them. And she's right, because almost immediately the workaround begins. Cobbler shops stay open, but their window displays shift. The official offerings look modest, tame. But if you ask for the midnight pair, that's when the good stuff comes out. Heels hidden in secret compartments. Toe extenders that clip on and off. Some even experiment with collapsible heels functional for walking dramatic for a rival. You remember the smug Baroness from 2 nights ago? She's now strutting around in heels that technically meet the law's specifications, until she pulls a satin ribbon and the extra lift snaps into place. Ingenious, she whispers with the tone of someone who just got away with mild treason. The law, of course, has loopholes big enough to dance through. It applies mostly to formal court appearances, state banquets, and royal ceremonies. But what about private salons? What about carriage rides? What about midnight strolls through the moonlit gardens of Fontainebleau? There the heels get pointier, taller, more rebellious. And let's not forget satire. Playwrights slip jabs into their comedies. Painters exaggerate heels in portraits. One anonymous cartoon from the time shows a noblewoman towering on a shoe so absurdly tall that she's being propped up by 4 footmen. The caption reads, "Her Grace suspended by etiquette." You pause at a window and watch the court swirl in motion. No one's really complying, not fully, but everyone's pretending to. Just enough to avoid punishment. Just enough to nod at authority while winking at fashion. This, after all, is how style survives, by adapting faster than the rules. You walk into a tailor's workshop, tucked in a palace side wing. They're mid-design drafting blueprints for lawful-looking shoes with illegal flair. There's a young assistant sketching a heel that's wide at the base, but secretly slopes upward inside, giving the same height without the obvious offense. We call it the illusion lift, he whispers, not looking up. The tailors share secrets with cobblers who share secrets with the courtiers who pass it all down to their valets. And slowly a subculture is born, one of compliance masquerading as rebellion. Or maybe rebellion masquerading as compliance. Honestly, you can't tell anymore. You sit by the fire in that workshop for a while, watching sparks fly from a tiny forge. The scent of scorched leather hangs in the air, warm and nostalgic. And as you drift deeper into the soft clatter of tools and whispered laughter, one thing becomes perfectly clear. The law wasn't about shoes. It never was. You wake to the sound of bells. Not church bells or warning bells, fashion bells. Specifically, the tiny silver one stitched into the hem of a noblewoman's walking gown, announcing her presence with every delicate sway. You're back in Versailles, trailing behind a sea of silk and perfume, and the new heel law has officially gone into effect. Sort of. Because as you follow the crowd into the outer gallery, you realize something: nobody's taking it very seriously. Not really. It's one thing to draft a regulation. It's quite another to enforce it in a world where everyone's paid not to notice. Still, the mood has shifted. There's a nervousness in the air, like someone might pull out a measuring tape at any moment. Court ladies pause to adjust their shoes more frequently. Gentlemen glance down mid-conversation, subtly confirming that their toes haven't become too scandalously sharp overnight. You drift toward the administrative chambers again. It's not glamorous, but it's where the new heel inspectors work. Yes, those exist now. The law has created a new class of palace employee whose sole responsibility is to check footwear at formal gatherings. Imagine being hired to judge someone's arch curvature. They wear gray uniforms, not powdered wigs, and they carry small ivory rulers. You watch one stop a young courtier. There's a quiet exchange. The shoe is examined and the man is gently turned away from the ballroom. "Too sharp," the inspector mutters. "Come back, flatter." The courtier doesn't protest. He bows, turns, and disappears, but you know where he's going. Straight to his valet to find the hidden pair. Because that's how this works now. For every rule, there's a workaround. You slip behind a curtain and into a dressing room. It's quiet here, lit by a low lamp and the steady murmur of vanity. A lady's maid is helping her mistress into an ensemble that meets every requirement, until she lifts the hem and reveals a pair of heels so exaggerated they could double as sculptural furniture. They'll never see them under the skirt, the maid grins. And they won't. Enforcement, it turns out, is mostly symbolic. The law exists to be seen, to be cited, to be whispered about. It's theater. Fashion legislation with the same energy as a stage play. Act like you're following it, and you'll be fine. But some take it seriously, especially the moralists. One priest, Father Arnaud, delivers weekly sermons now on the sin of elevation. You listen through a half-closed chapel door as he paces before his congregation, holding a lady's heel aloft like a relic. To rise artificially is to challenge the divine balance, he declares, eyes shining. Let your humility be flat-souled. You stifle a yawn. Behind you, a bored altar boy doodles caricatures of fashionable shoes in the margins of his prayer book. Historians still argue whether the church truly believed in the spiritual danger of high heels, or simply saw a cultural moment ripe for moral leverage. The answer, as usual, is probably both. A convenient metaphor, after all, is almost as powerful as a literal rule. Still, not everyone is on board. A handful of nobles begin mocking the new law by hosting heel salons' private events where guests wear the most outrageous footwear they can design. The point is to defy regulation, yes, but also to laugh in its face. Some shoes light up with candles, others are shaped like miniature thrones. One notable baron commissions a heel shaped like a coiled serpent. Symbol of temptation, he says, winking. You attend one of these salons. It feels like a dream, a surreal runway show where art and rebellion blend into something deliciously absurd. Each guest is introduced by their shoe, not their name. And every step they take is a challenge to authority wrapped in brocade and bravado. Still, word gets out. Soon there's talk of surveillance. Informants. Anonymous letters to court officials. My neighbor's wife wore a heel that defies the line of modesty. Another, the Duchess of Something. Something has been seen rising nearly 3 houses in public. The paranoia grows. So does the creativity. You find yourself at a cobbler's late one night watching as he unveils his latest invention, a collapsible heel. With a gentle twist, the shoe's back folds inward, reducing its height instantly. Transformation in a step, he says proudly. Regal for arrival. Righteous for inspection. You clap softly, it's genius and ridiculous and perfect. But not everyone is playing. Some, especially among the lower aristocracy, begin avoiding heels altogether. They see the writing on the parquet fashion as becoming a trap. One misstep and your reputation could tumble. So they go flat practically. Symbolically, even a little smugly. Let the peacock's preen, one viscount mutters to you at a garden party, slipping off his soft, flat slippers. I'll be over here not breaking my ankle for clout. Meanwhile, the court grows more brittle. Less about grace, more about theater. Every step feels staged, every heel click echoes like a warning. And yet life continues. A wedding takes place. The bride's shoes are inspected by 3 different officials. She passes. Barely. A birth is celebrated, the newborn gifted a pair of ceremonial infant heels, entirely non-functional but exquisitely sewn. A funeral procession rolls past. You notice the widow's feet hidden beneath layers of crepe. No one comments, but you know what they're wondering. Did she rise for grief, or did she flatten herself into mourning? Shoes are still just shoes, but they've also become something else. A language, a battleground, a joke, a law, a rebellion. A mirror held up to a kingdom trying desperately to hold itself together through fabric and polish and bone-deep denial. Now, you're in a salon, one of the more exclusive ones in Paris, far from the palace, but somehow closer to power. The ceiling is low, the walls thick with tobacco smoke and philosophy, and the woman at the center of the room is holding court. not with a crown or a decree, but with an open book and a razor-sharp tongue. Madame de Salm is her name tonight. It might change tomorrow. She's reclining in a fainting chair dressed in unstructured muslin, scandalously heelless and completely unbothered. Around her are writers, thinkers, the sons and daughters of merchants who've read Rousseau too many times to be polite anymore. They're talking loudly about the heel law, not the way Versailles talks about it, not in whispers, not behind fans. Here they're saying the quiet part out loud. It's control, says a young man who hasn't combed his hair in 3 days. It's the state trying to anchor identity to the ankle. Madame de Salm laughs. It's men afraid of being outdressed. Someone else suggests heels are an outdated symbol of nobility, like crests or duels or powdered wigs that kill small birds when they turn too fast. Another quotes Locke somewhat inaccurately while gesturing with a heel-shaped wine bottle stopper. The conversation rolls teasing, mocking occasionally brilliant. And through it all, the central idea pulses. If the state can legislate your shoes, what else can it legislate? Historians still argue whether this class of salon intellectuals had any real influence on the revolution that would soon come crashing through Versailles' gates. But what's certain is this: they saw fashion as politics. And a heel wasn't just a heel, it was a symbol of how far you were allowed to rise and how quickly you might fall. Back in the capital, pamphlets begin circulating. Some are satirical woodcuts of nobles impaled on their own stilettos. Others are deadly serious, with titles like The Tyranny of Toes and Elevation and Enslavement, A Citizen's Guide to Foot Freedom. You find one left on a cafe table. The cover shows a shoemaker's hand reaching up toward a glittering heel, balanced just out of reach. The heel's owner is invisible, a silhouette of excess. Inside are paragraphs of fury linking footwear to inequality, the monarchy, and even starvation. One line sticks with you. He who eats air walks in air. He who walks in air lives above bread. Poetic if a bit dramatic, but the sentiment catches fire. Soon in poorer districts, pointy heels are mocked openly. Bakers create heel cakes tall, narrow pastries designed to collapse when touched. Children chant rhymes about nobles who trip into the sewer on their sugar shoes. Even shop mannequins start shifting toward flatter profiles, displaying a kind of revolutionary sensibility. We walk among the people now. You stroll down one of these streets. It's muddy, busy, loud, no lace, no powdered wigs, just hard-working people with hard-working feet. And there, in a second-hand window, you spot something strange, a sign reading, "We do not sell shoes that break the people." Inside the shopkeeper, a stout woman with more apron than patience explains, "We make shoes for walking, not for pretending." She offers you a pair of simple leather slippers. No curve, no shine. They feel honest. You slip them on. Relief floods through your calves. She nods satisfied. You wear those, you get places. Elsewhere, though, nobles are doubling down. If the poor mock heels, they'll build taller ones. If the intellectuals flatten out, the elite will rise further. It's a silent tug of war in leather and lace. A particular count, his name isn't important, but his ego begins wearing heels embedded with tiny sapphires. So the floor may know whom it supports, he declares. Another hosts a Heels of Heaven party where guests arrive on literal footstools carried by servants. The heels themselves are displayed in glass domes like relics from a vanished era. And maybe they are, because the more the world mocks them, the more absurd they seem. The heels, the laws, the pretense. In Versailles, things grow tense. The inspectors still measure, but their hearts aren't in it. A few disappear from their posts, reportedly embarrassed to be part of such vanity. Enforcement slips, resistance rises. One day you hear a rumor a noblewoman has been arrested, not for politics, not for pamphlets, but for her shoes. She wore a pair of 6-inch purple monstrosities into a civic event and was promptly escorted out by 2 gendarmes. The crowd cheered. Not because they hated her, though perhaps they did, but because the heel had become a symbol of mockery. You visit the place it happened. It's just a stone courtyard now, empty. But you can still imagine the moment. The clatter of the heel, the hush of the crowd, the thunderous silence when a piece of fashion crumbled into evidence. Later that evening, back in the salon, Madame de Salm summarizes it best. A country is in trouble, she says, swirling her wine when the length of a toe becomes a matter of law. You nod. And as the candles burn low and your borrowed shoes rest by the door mercifully flat and blissfully quiet, you begin to understand just how strange and how deeply telling this whole saga really is. You're in a shadowy corner now, not of a palace, not of a salon, but of a dimly lit townhouse in Paris where the curtains stay closed and the whispers are worth more than coin. This is where the black market heel trade has found its foothold. Literally. You wouldn't know it walking by. The sign out front says Antiquités and Dentelles, but step through the third door on the left and nod twice at the man with the gray cravat, and you're in. Welcome to the underground salon of Fashion Rebellion. Here amid rows of mismatched chairs and a floor that creaks with every defiant step, you find them heels. Glorious, shimmering, sharp-toed, sky-reaching heels, illegal, unofficial, unmeasured, and very much in demand. The shoemaker, a wiry man named Etienne with ink-stained fingers and eyes that dart like sparrows, gives you a wink. They want heels they can hide, he says, but not hide too well. He lifts a box lid like he's revealing a sacred object. Inside, a pair of rose gold heels with collapsible arches, detachable toe tips, and if you press a hidden seam, embedded scent pouches that release bergamot and defiance. You blink. You've entered the luxury arms race of subversive footwear. Historians still argue whether this underground trade was primarily driven by vanity or as a form of protest. But here in this room, it feels like both. A desperate clinging to beauty in a world tightening its grip. A whispered rebellion told not through pamphlets or speeches, but through stitching slope and shine. The clientele arrives quietly. A lady in mourning, her veil drawn. A duke's son in disguise. A foreign diplomat's wife speaking only in coded gestures. They remove their flat, state-approved shoes and slip into something taller, bolder, then vanish back into the city 1 inch closer to scandal. Outside revolution brews. Bread prices soar, people chant in the streets. But down here, fashion hasn't surrendered. It's adapted. It always does. You sit for a while beside a wall of discarded shoes, some ruined, some beautiful, all illegal. A teenage apprentice brings you tea in a chipped porcelain cup. Most of these never see sunlight, he tells you. They're worn once, maybe twice. Then hidden away. Why bother, you ask? He shrugs. Some people need to remember they can still rise even if just on their toes. Elsewhere in the city, the heel law is being enforced with increasing randomness. A merchant's wife is fined for her boots. A baron's mistress is ignored for hers. It's no longer about the shoe. It's about who's wearing it, who's watching, and who's protected. At court, the mood turns petty. One noblewoman plants informants among her rivals' maids hoping to catch someone tiptoeing above regulation. Another hosts a compliance party where guests compete for the flattest footwear, though everyone knows the prize is actually sarcasm. Even in art, the shift is visible. A popular caricature shows a courtier wearing shoes so tall, they need stilts beneath their gown. The caption reads, "When the sole is short, the heel must stretch." Another shows a nobleman stepping over peasants, his shoes stained red, not with paint, but with metaphor. You pass a bookseller's stall where someone has tucked a pair of real forbidden heels into the window display, framed like relics. A crowd gathers. No one dares touch them, but they stare like they're remembering something lost. Back in Etienne's workshop, a woman arrives in silence. She's older, wrapped in furs, out of season, with eyes like weathered glass. She places a shoe on the table, one he didn't make. It's ancient, cracked, probably from Louis XIV's era. Red heel, heavy buckle. A heel that once walked through real power. "I want this copied," she says. Etienne nods. No questions asked. The apprentice draws the design on parchment, hands trembling slightly. When it's done, they wrap it in oilcloth and pass it back to the woman. "Use it wisely," Etienne whispers. She leaves, and you sit there stunned, wondering what battle she's about to walk into. What kind of war requires a shoe like that? Because it's not just fashion anymore. Not really, these heels are statements. Weapons, flags, they're not just about rising. They're about reminding people you can. And somewhere deep beneath all the marble and lace, someone in power knows that. Which is why they're afraid. Not of the shoe itself, but of the people who keep walking tall despite the rules. You're in a dressing room again, but not just any dressing room. This one belongs to a duchess. You can tell by the abundance of lavender sachets, imported silk slippers, and mirrors in every direction, so a person might admire themselves from all angles, even the most unflattering ones. And tonight this Duchess is preparing for a royal gathering. Now officially her heels are regulation height, modest, almost boring, but you already know better. You've seen the trick shoes, the hidden panels, the transformation soles, and sure enough, there it is, a pair of seemingly innocent heels with a concealed lift stitched beneath the brocade. Her maid helps her into them with the quiet expertise of someone who's done this before. And you watch as the Duchess rises only slightly but unmistakably higher than allowed. She checks herself in the mirror and smiles. Not sweetly, strategically. This is the courtier's workaround. You follow her to the palace. She glides down the corridor, her skirt brushing the marbled floor heels, clicking with just enough subtlety to be heard, but not enough to be questioned. When she reaches the guard at the ballroom entrance, she performs a practiced bow. The guard, used to more blatant offenses, waves her through. And she's not alone. Inside the ballroom, it's a parade of near legality. Shoes that pass at a glance but not under scrutiny. Pointed toes shortened by velvet applique. Heels curved just shy of forbidden. It's fashioned by loophole, and the entire nobility is in on it. You slip into a corner and observe. The ballroom is candlelit humid with perfume and political tension. And it's filled with dancers whose movements have been subtly adjusted to hide their balance because every step must be graceful and lawful. Every inch must be earned with subtlety. And every guest here is performing that balance like a secret ballet. A duke tall and stiff is wearing shoes that seem entirely within regulation until he shifts weight and you hear the soft click of a heel extension engaging. A debutante's slippers appear flat, but she walks with the delicate roll of someone elevated just enough to feel it in the calves. It's not just fashion anymore, it's choreography. Everyone's in on the game. You make your way to the refreshment table carefully because someone just tripped on a lace train and overhear two noblewomen comparing notes. One swears by detachable arch lifts that snap into place after inspection. The other has commissioned shoes with sloping interiors so steep they induce mild vertigo. It's the dizziness of power, she laughs. The Duchess from earlier finds you and leans in. Would you like to know the newest trick, she whispers. I wear an undersole of compressed cork. Silent, hidden, adds half a pouce without a trace. You nod, half impressed, half exhausted. Historians still argue whether these workarounds were a form of subtle protest or simply another layer of vanity. But you realize something as you watch the dancers spin. They're not trying to rebel. They're trying to stay visible. In a world that punishes extravagance yet still rewards spectacle, fashion becomes survival. These nobles aren't defying the law out of courage. They're evading it to remain part of the performance. Because if you disappear in court, even by falling half an inch behind you, cease to exist. You slip into the back hallway where the servants move. Their shoes are flat, practical, and their gait is relaxed, confident. No tripping, no shifting weight to balance elegance and legality. Just walking. One maid gives you a look. It's funny, she says. They've made walking harder than ruling. You both laugh quietly. In another wing of the palace, there's a small room where cobblers now work on retainer. You peek inside. It's more laboratory than workshop. Wooden molds of feet line the shelves. There are rulers, compasses, spirit levels. One shoemaker is muttering to himself, measuring angles with the intensity of someone performing surgery. He doesn't notice you. He's busy testing a new heel made from hollowed birch and stuffed with scented cotton. Lighter, he mutters. Lighter means faster. Faster means undetected. You watch as he fits it to a mannequin leg. The toe narrows into a needle-like point. He stands back and smiles, perfectly within regulation until you walk. Back in the ballroom, the music has slowed. You watch a waltz now, each couple circling like precision clocks. Every step is a quiet rebellion, every spin an affirmation. One guest stumbles just slightly and three heads turn. Her heel was too sharp, too obvious, but she recovers, laughs, pretends it was the floor. She'll be more careful next time, because here at court, balance is everything. The rules are less about what's allowed and more about what you can hide. The shoemakers adapt, the dancers adjust, and the court in its obsession with form becomes a place where deception is the only thing worn honestly. The law hasn't changed behavior, it's just changed the angle of it. You're in a pew now, hard-polished wood, slightly too narrow positioned, directly under the disapproving glare of a carved angel. The church is grand, but cold, and the sermon is already in full swing. Thanks. And so drones Father Belay from the pulpit. we must ask ourselves, what does it mean to raise oneself above one's station? Are we not taught to walk humbly with our God? He isn't talking about pride, not really. He's talking about heels. Yes, the church has joined the conversation, and it's brought incense fire and brimstone to the fashion floor. Today's homily is focused on the moral perils of elevation. According to Father Belay, heels encourage arrogance, vanity, and perhaps even something more carnal. He doesn't say the word, but his tone leans heavily toward it. The congregation shifts in their seats. A woman in the front row crosses her legs too quickly and draws a sharp glance from the choir loft. You glance down at your shoes, simple, flat, unassuming, and wonder if your soul is passing or failing. The church hasn't always hated heels. In earlier centuries, bishops wore elevated shoes too. In fact, ecclesiastical footwear once rivaled that of the nobility in terms of ornament. But that was before this particular storm of law lace and secular splendor. Now the church wants distance. In sermons, leaflets, and whispered confessions, clergy condemn heels as tools of seduction and symbols of spiritual imbalance. They quote scripture out of context, "Thou shalt not exalt thyself and conveniently forget the gold-threaded vestments stored in their own sacristies." Historians still argue whether this moral crusade against shoes was born from genuine religious anxiety or a calculated attempt to reclaim cultural authority as the monarchy stumbled. Either way, the heel becomes a scapegoat. It's not just a wedge of leather anymore. It's the root of female vanity, the seed of sin, the lift before the fall. You linger after the service near the church vestibule where confessions are heard. A young woman kneels behind the screen, voice trembling. "Forgive me, Father," she whispers. "I wore the sapphire pair to the garden party." "I didn't mean to draw attention." You hear the priest sigh. And what came of it? A compliment, she says, from the Comte de Mirecourt. The confessional clicks shut like a chastity belt for fashion. You back away quietly. But even here, not everyone agrees. You slip into the sacristy where vestments hang and the scent of beeswax lingers. One young cleric, fresh-faced, still smoothing the creases from his cassock, leans toward you conspiratorially. Between us, he says, "I think the whole heel thing is ridiculous." You raise an eyebrow. "It's a shoe," he shrugs. "God made us with feet. The rest is tailoring." You smile. There's always one. But his superiors don't share the sentiment. A new ecclesiastical bulletin goes out that very week. No heels above modest height shall be worn by women attending services. This isn't canon law, mind you, it's social pressure dressed in velvet robe. At first, compliance is high. Parishioners show up in flatter shoes. No one wants to be called out during communion. But then it happens. One Sunday at a high mass in Rouen, a noblewoman arrives in full regalia, hat, gloves, and crimson heels. She walks slowly, precisely with the air of someone deeply aware of the spectacle. Murmurs spread like smoke. She kneels. She stands. She takes the Eucharist without flinching, and then she leaves. No lightning strike, no collapse, just the echo of her shoes down the stone aisle. The next week, 3 others follow her example. The week after that, 12. And suddenly a new fashion is born, the confessional heel. High enough to matter, modest enough to excuse. They're sold by cobblers under names like Grace Lift's Sanctified Arch and less subtly the Penitent Point. There are lace-up versions, ankle boots, even prayer-friendly platforms. One bishop declares them an insult to the altar. They sell out in 3 days. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, you learn something even more delicious. Some clergy are cheating too. You're helping sort donations at a monastery when you find them a pair of crimson-soled slippers tucked under a novice's cot. Soft leather, exquisite craftsmanship. Definitely not state-issued. Later, you overhear 2 abbots arguing about the heel law. One insists the church must uphold the monarchy's example. The other mutters, if we had their shoes, we might walk straighter paths. You think of Father Belay now pacing his pulpit in platform sandals hidden beneath his robes, and you can't help it, you laugh. Because here's the secret, everyone wants a little lift. Even those preaching against it. And so the irony grows. The monarchy outlaws shoes to maintain order. The nobility cheats to maintain status. The church condemns the height while stepping quietly into it. And the people, they notice. They watch these games of inches and arches. They mark the hypocrisy. And while no one says it out loud, the thought is already forming. If they lie about heels, what else are they lying about? You're not in Versailles anymore. You're trudging down a muddy road just outside Lyon, shoes thick with dirt, hem-soaked, and the sound of distant bells swallowed by wind and livestock. The countryside has its own rhythm, and here, far from salons and statutes, no one's talking about heel curvature. Because in the provinces, people have more pressing concerns. You pass a farmer swinging a hoe over his shoulder. His boots are wide, flat, and cracked. Solid. He nods at you without pausing and mutters, "Shoes are for standing, not showing." Behind him, a group of peasant women walk single file down the path toward market. Their feet are bare. Not out of protest, but out of necessity. Heels here are just something you've heard of. Like opera, or soup with more than one ingredient. And yet even here, the echoes of the law reach. In the village square, there's a faded notice nailed to the side of the church: attention. All citizens to adhere to decrees regarding apparel within district gatherings. No mention of shoes directly, but everyone knows what it means. The cobbler's shop is quiet. Inside, you find a man in his 60s shaping soles with tools older than his teeth. He glances up when you enter. "Looking for city shoes, are you?" he asks with a chuckle. "We've got none." He gestures toward a row of practical boots. "These walk, they don't sing." Still, he shows you something curious from under his bench, a pair of heels carved from cherry wood. Rustic. Rough. Clearly for practice or jest. "Had a noblewoman come through last winter," he says. "Wanted to gift them to her maid. Said if you're going to suffer, might as well suffer upright." He shrugs. Didn't stay long. Couldn't manage the mud. You sit with him a while as he works. No candles, just sunlight and sawdust. It feels like breathing again. And it's here you realize in the capital heels are law. Out here, they're just legend. Still, fashion trickles down. Slowly then, all at once. At the next village fair, you see a merchant's daughter wearing a pair of makeshift heeled slippers. Not law-breaking, but certainly law-skirting. She walks carefully, wobbling every few steps. She's watched by everyone, admired by some, scolded by others. Her mother pretends not to notice. The local priest glares, but says nothing, because even here people want to rise. Just a little. Historians still argue whether rural reactions to fashion laws were deliberate resistance or passive disregard. But the truth feels simpler people weren't disobeying. They were just busy. One miller scoffs when asked about the heel law. If they're writing rules about shoes, he says, then they've run out of bread to tax. A shepherd barefoot and sun-darkened shakes his head. "My goats wouldn't care if I wore golden hooves. Why should I?" But slowly, curiously, resentment starts to grow. Because when the magistrate arrives, well-fed, well-dressed, and just barely above the allowed heel height, he's noticed. Not for his proclamations, but for the way he stands a little taller than everyone else. And how his boots leave shallower prints in the same soil. The people see it. They don't say much, not yet, but they remember. You spend a night in the farmhouse of a washerwoman named Bernadette. She has 7 children and no patience for court gossip. Over dinner, she tells you what she's heard, that in Paris, nobles can wear any heel if they bribe the right person. That a duchess was seen in 5-inch slippers at a funeral. That inspectors turn blind eyes for gold coins. "And they fine us for wearing lace," she says, slamming a wooden spoon on the table. "Lace on a baby's cap." She laughs bitterly. "My cousin's son went to Paris once. Said their feet never touch the ground." I believe it. And suddenly you see it. The shoes, the law, the whole ridiculous system, it isn't just about footwear. It's about ground. Who walks on it? Who floats above it? Who gets punished for trying to lift even a toe out of the mud? That's why the resentment festers. Because for every duchess strutting through a loophole in crimson heels, there's a farmer's wife being fined for trying to dress up for church. The shoe becomes a symbol, not of fashion, not anymore, of distance, of insult, of how far removed the nobles are from the earth everyone else still has to walk. And while no one here quotes Rousseau or plots revolution over tea, you feel the weight building. Step by step, inch by inch in the dirt, and the fields and the cracked souls of people who have nothing left to polish. It's coming, not because of shoes, but because of what they represent. You're back in the city now, in a candlelit parlor thick with pipe smoke and powdered wigs. The fireplace glows low, the chairs are pulled close, and there's a debate unraveling so slowly it's practically melting. This is a salon of thinkers, not nobles, not clergy philosophes. Men and women who read, who write, who question the structure of everything, including fashion, especially fashion. One man, long-nosed and draped in a robe de chambre that looks suspiciously like it once belonged to a duchess, raises his glass. Now, if we legislate shoes, he says we legislate identity. The others nod, mulling, and then, or perhaps offers a woman in spectacles far too modern for this century, we reveal how little identity we're allowed to claim without permission. Tonight the topic is this: why are we policing appearance in an age of reason? You sip your wine and listen as they unravel the logic or lack thereof behind the heel law. One guest claims it's a distraction tactic that the monarchy uses clothing laws to deflect from famine. Another insists it's about reinforcing obedience, beginning with the body's most basic tool movement. It's not about fashion, says an old philosopher whose beard is longer than his patience. It's about freedom. You hear that word a lot these days, because this is the age of enlightenment. In cafes and salons and poorly ventilated lecture halls, people are talking about liberty, reason, the rights of man. And increasingly about the absurdity of regulating toe angles while people starve in the streets. You drift outside to get air. The city is buzzing, not loud, not angry yet, but tense. Lanterns swing in doorways. Vendors bark until hoarse. And everywhere you see people walking, and watching, and comparing. Heels are still worn, of course, even with the laws, even with the whispers. But now they've taken on a second shape, something closer to satire than style. You pass a group of students each wearing a different absurd shoe on each foot. One heel tall, one flat. A metaphor, they say, laughing, you keep walking. Later you spot a pamphlet tacked to a wall. The title, Heels of Hypocrisy. How the king's feet outrank the people's backs. It's crude. The drawing shows a nobleman stomping across the backs of peasants in jewel-encrusted boots. But it hits its mark. These ideas are spreading. Even the Enlightenment's most reserved voices begin to chime in. Montesquieu writes a short essay on the theatricality of law, mocking how court rules obsess over height while ignoring hunger. Voltaire, never one to miss a punchline, writes a fictional dialogue between a nobleman and his shoe, where the heel ends up more intelligent. Historians still argue whether the Enlightenment thinkers truly cared about fashion regulation or simply used it as a rhetorical tool. Either way, they elevated it, made it public, made it philosophy, and the public responds. In the markets, the chatter shifts. Bread tax war and heels. Did you hear the new term someone asked at a baker's stall? They call nobles le surélevés, the elevated. It's said with venom, not envy. In a theater, a satire opens Le Soulier de la Nation, the nation's shoe. The lead wears platform heels so exaggerated he must be lowered from the ceiling. Every time he speaks, a peasant character shouts, "We can't hear you from up there." It's a comedy, but barely. You return to the parlor. The air is thicker now, the mood darker. Someone's reading a newspaper article aloud another peasant uprising in the south. Trampled fields. A tacksman chased from the village. No deaths, but the anger is rising. And so is the symbolism. The heel is no longer a simple fashion object. It's now a synecdoche, a part representing the whole. To criticize the shoe is to criticize the system that justifies it. And the government knows this. A new ordinance is issued. This one not about height or pointiness, but about where certain shoes may be worn. Heels above a certain slope are banned at public gatherings. Political meetings, processions, even weddings if the guest list includes more than 20. The nobles are outraged less about the restriction itself, more that it acknowledges the connection. Our shoes are political now, one sneers at a supper. No one answers. They all know the truth. You walk home through the back streets. A woman with a basket of laundry nods at you, then glances at your shoes. They'll come for those next, she mutters. Not in jest, because regulation has turned to enforcement, and enforcement has begun to feel like surveillance. People measure one another not for style, but for loyalty, for clues of discontent, and shoes are now part of that language. If you wear flats, are you a sympathizer? If your heels are just a little too sharp, are you making a statement? The Enlightenment wanted to raise reason above superstition. But here in the heart of it, you realize something. The height of your shoe now measures the depth of your descent. You're walking slower now, more carefully, because the streets of Paris have changed. The tension is thicker, the air is sharper, and people are watching each other in a way that says the rules no longer feel like games. You pass a cafe where someone once read Voltaire aloud. Today, it's closed. A sign hangs in the window, ferme pour renovation. You know that's a lie. You heard the owner was taken in for questioning. He sold pamphlets under the counter and wore dangerously fashionable boots. You keep walking. The cobblestones are uneven. You nearly trip only to catch yourself on a lamppost and realize something funny: your shoes are flat now. Sensible. You didn't even notice when you made the switch. The fashion, the laws, the arguments. They've all receded into something more immediate: survival. Because the revolution is coming. And in a world where heads are being counted, heels have lost their height. Back in Versailles, the palace isn't the same either. It still shimmers, still echoes, still pretends. But beneath the perfume and protocol, something is cracking. You see it in the eyes of the staff, in the quiet of the gardens, in the empty chairs at banquets where once every seat was a statement. And you see it in the shoes. They've gotten quieter, lower, almost cautious. Not out of humility, but out of fear. You're in the Hall of Mirrors when it happens. A courier arrives. He looks panicked, sweaty, out of place among the gilding. He hands a folded parchment to a chamberlain and vanishes before anyone can stop him. The chamberlain reads. He turns pale. There's been an uprising in the city. A prison stormed, a mob forming, and among the looted items, heels, expensive ones. Trophy shoes from noble homes paraded through the streets like severed heads on sticks. You slip away before the panic spreads. Outside the gates, the people are marching, not in heels, not even in boots. Many of them barefoot or in wrapped rags, but they're stepping hard and the ground seems to notice. You blend into the crowd and watch the energy shift. Someone has painted a slogan across a wall: "Down with those who rise too high." Simple, sharp, not subtle. Historians still argue whether heels played a literal role in sparking revolutionary rage. Probably not. But symbolically, they were perfect. Shoes had come to represent everything wrong with the court. The excess, the distance, the absurdity. What better symbol of privilege than a duchess tripping across marble while a baker's wife stood shoeless in mud? And so, one by one, the symbols fall. You see nobles tearing off their heels before entering safe houses. You see cobblers changing their shop signs. You see paintings being defaced, red heels scratched out with soot and spit. It becomes dangerous to appear elevated, literally, figuratively. You pass a city square where a gallows is being constructed. Not for shoes, for people. But next to it, someone has tied a pair of bright blue heels to a post and painted a sign: "This is how they stood above us." There's laughter, then silence. The next day, the queen is spotted in flat slippers. Not because she's finally heeded public opinion, but because she has no choice. Her portraits are being burned. Her dresses mocked. Her shoes, once carefully measured by tailors and ministers, now carry the weight of a kingdom's hate. You find yourself back at Etienne's old workshop. The door is boarded up. Through a crack in the wall, you glimpse broken heels piled in a corner, some unfinished, some shattered midwear. You remember when they were treasures. Now they're evidence. A boy with soot on his face walks past and tosses a shoe into the Seine. You ask why. He shrugs. It doesn't belong to us. At night in a safe house, you remove your own shoes. You leave them by the fire and notice the heel is almost gone. Worn down, smoothed out, by walking, by change, by history. You think about all the things those shoes have walked through: salons, sermons, protests, muddy roads, whispered, laughter, shouted slogans. They're just leather and thread. But they carried you through the unraveling. And they'll carry you now into whatever comes next. Because even if you lower yourself, even if you walk softly, the world around you is rising. And some heights can't be undone. You're walking through ashes now. Not metaphorical ones, real ashes. The outer walls of Versailles still stand, but the inside hollowed, looted, echoing with absence. The air smells faintly of smoke and something even sharper: emptiness. You're not alone. A few others move through the ruins like ghosts with dirt under their nails. Someone picks through what's left of a tapestry. Someone else opens a drawer and finds nothing but an old shoe buckle bent out of shape, glittering like a relic no one asked for. You wander into the ballroom, or what used to be a ballroom. No more music. No more heels tapping like delicate drums across marble. Now it's just wind and dust and boot prints from those who came through looking for treasure and found history instead. And there in the corner, almost buried under plaster and gold flake, lies a single heel. It's red, a little cracked, still pointy, still standing. You pick it up. It's heavier than you expect, not because of its weight, but because of what it means. This was once power. Now it's a paperweight for a kingdom that collapsed under its own costume changes. You set it back down. Let someone else decide what it's worth, because the revolution has scrubbed the stage. The costumes are out of fashion. The shoes once illegal for being too tall are now dangerous for reminding people of what came before. Out in the streets, people wear practical boots, clogs, sandals, or nothing at all. Not because of style, because of reality. You can't trip over excess if you don't wear it, but not everyone lets go. In a quiet Paris studio, a former court painter now scratches a living doing portraits of citoyens. They wear tricolor sashes, not brocade. But if you look closely, really closely, some of them have just a whisper of curve to their shoes. An echo. Historians still argue whether aristocratic fashion vanished completely or simply adapted, waiting to be remembered. But even in this new republic, you sense it, the heel still haunts. You pass a pamphlet stand where someone's selling satirical prints of old nobles teetering on absurd stilts. One shows a guillotine blade shaped like a wedge heel. It's funny, it's horrifying, it's accurate. In the National Assembly, someone brings up a motion to ban excessive footwear during public service. It passes, barely. The mood is sour. Even the shoes must now walk in line. And yet, in a back alley, you spot a girl twirling in a discarded ballroom slipper. Just one. It doesn't fit, not really, but she balances anyway, laughing. Because what once symbolized power has become play. You keep walking. The museums are starting to fill. Curators hungry for objects to narrate what the monarchy meant have begun collecting a red heel, a silver buckle, a pair of boots, said to belong to a famous mistress. They don't label them as shoes, they label them as evidence. Exhibit O excess. You lean over a glass case. Inside a pointed shoe on faded velvet. The plaque reads, Court heel circa 1775. Prohibited under Royal Ordinance 240B. Worn to defy regulation. Preserved to remember why regulation was needed. You pause, because it's a lot to place on a piece of footwear. But then again, wasn't it always later you sit in a public garden, what was once a noble estate? Children play near the fountains. Their feet are bare. A group of young women strolls by. Sensible shoes, practical skirts. Then you see one, wearing a small heel. It's not tall, it's not rebellious, just elegant. No one says anything. And that's how it begins again. Not with laws, not with rebellion, but with memory. Because fashion always returns, but it never forgets. Now you're in a museum. Not a grand one, a quieter one. Tucked between a stationery shop and a bookstore in a sleepy corner of Paris. The kind of place people only visit on rainy Tuesdays or field trips. But inside, past the creaky floors and dusty busts of half-remembered nobles, is a single room that feels familiar. You've been here before. Sort of. The walls are pale. The glass cases hum gently with their own importance. And the object's shoes. Just shoes. But not just any shoes. There's a display of red heels, faded, frayed, defiant. Beside them, a court document in looping script, the infamous heel ordinance, preserved like a butterfly in amber. Nearby, an anonymous cartoon of a baron tripping in his own arrogance. The caption still makes you smirk. At the center, a rotating stand holds a pair of scandalous pointy slippers. Silver-threaded. Exquisitely curved. So delicate they seem to hover. The plaque reads, Contraband fashion circa 1778. Likely worn only once. Confiscated, preserved. You walk slowly, reading each label, each footnote. A group of students murmurs behind you. One laughs, I can't believe they wrote laws about shoes. You want to turn and say, no, you misunderstand. They weren't just about shoes. They were about who was allowed to stand taller. Historians still argue whether the heel law mattered in the long run, whether it shaped revolution or merely accessorized it. But the fact that these shoes are behind glass decades, centuries later, says something. We kept them. We made room for them. And that tells you all you need to know. You sit on a bench in the corner and watch. Visitors come and go. Most skim past the shoes, but a few linger. A teenager takes a photo. A woman in orthopedic flats leans in close and whispers, "My grandmother had a pair like that." Fashion fades, but symbols echo. You glance at your own shoes, modern, supportive, regulation-free, and wonder what they might say about you centuries from now. Will someone one day stare at their shape and guess your values, your role, your limits? Because that's what shoes did in 18th century France. They weren't just for walking, they were for showing who you were allowed to be. Outside Paris moves on. Children splash in puddles. Couples share umbrella space. No one thinks about their shoes, not really. But in this room, time slows. Here the heel stands still, pointed, arched, absurd, glorious. And you understand at last what it meant to be 1 inch higher and what it cost to stay there. And now, as the museum lights dim behind your eyes, you feel the story soften like leather worn smooth by time. The clatter of heels fades into silence. No more clamor, no more law, just the steady hush of history breathing through threadbare silk. Let the colors blur, the labels dissolve. Let your thoughts drift not to courts and revolutions, but to the simple comfort of walking on your own terms. No elevation, no judgment, just soft steps on quiet floors. Outside, the rain begins. Gentle, rhythmic, like the old songs of servants scrubbing marble or cobblers stitching by candlelight. You're far from Versailles now, far from the debates. Just a soul still grounded, resting. Let your breath follow that rhythm. In, out, in, out. You've walked far tonight. Sleep now. You've earned it.